And we are recording, and we'll turn the time in our seminar over to Dr. Andy Gibbons, a former faculty member in this department, former department chair, former faculty member at Utah State, and a professional career as well. He was also my dissertation chair, so it's his fault that you have to take classes from me. Great friend of our department, a great friend to me personally over the years, really excited to hear from him about conversational patterns in instruction. So if you'll just join me in welcoming Andy to our seminar today. Okay. Okay. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. I am amazed at the progress in this department, its facilities, and its faculty since I was here. I retired, I think, about 5 or 6 years ago. After a wonderful 15 years in this department. 13, no, it was 13. What an exciting place this is. Actually change things. This is not a trivial department. Its impact in the church and without the church. There are marvelous things happening because what you'll find is that you go out equipped with some wonderful concepts, and because you're wonderful people, they will love having you out there. So just an encouragement that you're in the right place, doing the right thing. Let's see. All right, now I'm going to do a fair amount of reading today because I've chosen my words carefully, and I hope you'll listen to them carefully. I'm going to talk about something that is invisible. So I need for you to put on your invisible glasses today and be ready to see something that was invisible to you before. As a first author in this study, I've been working for over 20 years on research into the inner structure of instructional designs, an architectural approach to instructional design. Traditional approaches to designing instruction that go under the heading of ISD are useful for managing design projects. They do not describe the design process itself, nor the interior architecture of a design. That's what we're going to talk about today, is the inner architecture of a design. The result of this 20-year
Somebody's sending a message to you, Andy.
Okay. Hello. Yeah. Okay. And that one. So what do I do? This. Okay. The result of this 20-year project, sorry for all those noises. The result of this 20-year project was a book, and I think it sold, I think 10, maybe 12 copies.
I have a copy.
Thank you.
You have a copy in the IP&T library.
Oh, that's 2, and my mom was 3. So this is the book, and these railroad ties, what look like railroad ties. And it turns out that the railroad ties is what we're going to talk about. Let's see what worked. That didn't work. Yes, it did. Each set of ties represents a structural layer of a generic instructional design. There is such a thing as a generic instructional design. It's like the multiple layers, three-dimensional weaving. Are you familiar with three-dimensional weaving? It exists. Or like the layers of a rainforest, which consists of multiple layers of organisms in a rainforest, each carrying out a specific function as a part of a larger organism, the forest itself. It's a living thing. Each instructional design has its own design theories, design practices, design team roles and specialties, design tools, design literature, and professional organizations. Surprising, we don't think about that. And these are different for each layer. Work at this point has made a validation argument for 3 of the 4 major layers of this theory: content, strategy, and control. The content layer parses knowledge structures in ways that are appropriate to an audience and a goal. The theoretical literature for this layer describes ways of structuring and capturing what we commonly call knowledge, which is a misnomer. We can more appropriately talk about action systems or dynamic models. The strategy layer describes a practical bridge with the real world by partitioning time, space, goals, and activity. Notice time, space, goals are abstract. Activity is concrete. So they bridge a design from a theoretical position to something real. Strategy layer design creates events, which are intersections of or momentary groupings of physical setting, social setting, participant role, learning companion role, goals, activity, information content, interaction, communication infrastructure, assessment, and sequencing. An event is something, well, it's kind of like a bite of the hamburger instead of the whole hamburger of experience at once. You're going to subject people to learning experiences. You can't cram all of the things that you want a person to know into one big event. So practically, we have to divide it by time, by space. It has to happen in a place, activity, and goal. Let's see, what number am I on? Number 10. Control layer design specifies ways in which the learner can communicate during instruction through different action modalities that can include text, voice, joystick, gesture, multiple modalities at once. And this brings to mind the sophisticated game consoles that are used or the controls that are used for in a virtual reality experience. Today's subject, oh, by the way, and these layers that I just talked about, content, strategy, control, have been validated to the extent that their reality can be recognized, that they do have a theory basis, that they have a specialized body of knowledge related to them. If you'll stop and think, if you've ever worked on a design team, that team fragments into specialty areas. That's just prima facie recognition of the fact that there are different layers of the design, different functional layers that are designed. And when you get into industry, which many of you will discover that you're working with design teams. You won't work just by yourself when you get out there, even though that's what your experience is here, so you can learn. When you get out there, you will be part of a team and there will be specialists, and you'll have to recognize how the functional layers are represented by those different team members. Okay, so today's subject is the validation of the 4th major layer, the message layer. Elizabeth Bowling and I just recently published an ACT monograph on the message layer. We believe that it is a validation of the message layer, its reality, so to speak, and that it can be used as a tool. The pre-publication version of it is available on Scholars Archive, so enjoy that. It's more lengthy than I'm going to talk about today, clearly. Message layer is the most important layer. We discovered this. I mean, this really was research. We really came to realize this. It is the most important layer because it lies at the pivot point of meaning for all instructional communications. Bears repeating. At the pivot point of meaning for all instructional communications. Message is what you were trying to communicate. And there are many kinds of messages, as you'll see. Yet it is the least explored and the least documented of all the layers. For over 70 years, Elizabeth and I discovered that design theorists have attempted to describe how to create instructional conversations. They have come close to it, but found that their technologies and their theories do not allow them to do it, to actually create instructional conversations. The message layer and the message construct represent a major step forward in this quest. There are important reasons for studying instruction as a conversational phenomenon. This goes back to developmental psychology. Scientific research in developmental psychology shows that from infancy onward, conversational interactions with caregivers set the pattern for human, social, and learning interactions with the experienced world, which includes interactions during both formal and informal learning. When a child is handed to its mother and they start looking into each other's eyes, that is the beginning of a conversation. The child learns conversation by interacting with other people. It is the natural form of communication. Conversations, verbal and nonverbal, are how we communicate from infancy on. Tharp and Gallimore equate conversation and teaching. To truly teach, one must converse. To truly converse is to teach. Every conversation that you have in the hallway is really a teaching event, is really an instructional event. Information is exchanged, understandings are exchanged to some extent. Most instructional designers understand how frustrating it can be to design appropriate, quotes, interactions. Interactivity is a big topic. How do I build more interactivity into my instruction? Or how do I give them more practice with feedback? But often what gets designed is what is easy or possible under resources. We step back from what we would like them to be able to do, experience with the real world or simulate a real world, and we go with what we can with the tools and the resources that we have. New developments in social learning theory have led to innovative ways for staging instructional conversations. Some of these new approaches cannot even function without some amount of instructional conversation. Conversation involves the exchange of messages to convey information and emotion. I would say that the word emotion is an important part of that. We sometimes think that what we've just got to do is get information over to the student. But when you have a student who is struggling, like this one here is, this person clearly impacted by teachers, shunned by fellow students.
How did you know?
So an expert teacher, an expert classroom teacher will come over and gesture that it says, there's an emotion here. I care for you. You're okay. You're really okay. Our error in the past has been allowing ourselves to be dazzled by highly visible representations, which are coupled with messages, to the point where we remain blind to the existence of a message layer that underlays the representation layer. We're so anxious to build a representation. I just want to start building something. What we should be saying is, what am I going to build? What am I going to say? What am I trying to say? Do I have it clearly focused? Do I have the emotional aspects of it and other aspects of it? Have I designed the message before I designed the representation? Once we take the message layer out of the shadow of the representation layer, we see that the message layer decisions must be made before representation decisions. That very seldom happens. It becomes clear, for instance, that the theories and principles for designing messages are quite different from those for designing media representations. Visible representations claim our first attention because they appeal to the visual sense, very stimulating. And that's why it's been so hard for designers in the past to see the unique but invisible structures of the message layer. Representation is easy to see, message not so much. So the topic today is the message and not the medium, to play on a familiar phrase. Why the distinction between those two layers? Does anybody outside of our field notice it also? Etienne Wenger explains, for the purposes of this discussion, he's talking about building intelligent tutoring systems. They had to come directly into contact with the question of what is the message? What are the fragments of message that I'm putting together? For the purposes of this discussion, let us define a representation of knowledge very broadly as a mapping of knowledge in the abstract into physical medium. It is useful to be able to speak about the knowledge that is the source of this mapping. And we will use the adjective epistemic to refer to this disembodied level. The claim is that the distinction between the epistemic and the representation levels is useful in designing and evaluating models of communicable knowledge. Wenger was writing about intelligent tutoring systems. His question was, how do you take a tutor's intention and communicate it accurately and completely through a physical medium? And be assured, he asked, that the intention will be captured faithfully in the representation. Distinguish the inner from the outer representation. The problem begins here, right where the word here is. Before this man says anything, he has to know what he intends to say. Intention precedes representation. Notice that if he hasn't paid attention to his intention, it can come out in one way that does not communicate the idea faithfully to a receiver. Intention precedes representation. Here's an example. A standard feedback message consists of several smaller message elements combined into a larger message. How many times have we written a feedback frame like this? The bracketed text here denotes a message element, okay? Incorrect, you missed a step, demonstration of the correct step is available for you, touch of control, okay? For each message element, there are multiple representations that are possible. So you can say incorrect. How many different ways can you get across the idea, intention, saying it's incorrect? Well, you can do text, noise, voice, depending on what kind of a cultural metaphor you're speaking to. You also have the same for other elements of this message, other message elements. Each has multiple possible representations. So once again, you can do text, you can do voice, you can use color cues. There is a language of representation that is separate from the intention of what you're trying to say. Likewise, there are multiple possible control actions that the learner can do. You can have them hit a space bar, say a word. You can have them give them a default choice. Unless you do something that's going to happen. Notice that when the learner is expressing an intention, it has to find its voice. somehow. And so another question is, how do we make sure that the intention of the learner is really back to the instruction? If you don't have that insurance, you have no way of knowing what the student was really saying. And that's what conversation turns out to be for. And designers design instructional conversations. You say, that's really hard. How would I do that? There have been multiple historical approaches, which I would like to describe now. The research that we did, that Elizabeth and I did, 70 years of history in instructional technology, starting with the analytic approaches to classroom analysis. In the 1950s, over 100 systems for studying classroom messaging patterns were invented. 100 different systems of cataloging what happens, what's happening in the conversations in the classroom. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Susan Markle, beginning with Susan Markle, a leading researcher in programmed instruction, published a book called Good Frames and Bad, a grammar of frame writing. We don't read that anymore. Which she defined in detail a large number of message types that could be combined within program frames. Now, she didn't call them messages. She called them frame elements. The point is, she identified different kinds of things you can say at a given moment and said, you gotta pick. Following the same line of research, Evans, Glazer, and Homme devised a simpler taxonomy of message types called rule egg. Programmed in frame writers. Rule and egg stands for example. Rule, example, distinction. M. David Merrill built on this, devised a category system for classifying frame messages used in the development of the ticket system here at BYU. Now, interestingly enough, a frame is a program construct. It's a display concept, a representation concept. So you see that you have a single kind of construct that weds together the different layers of the design. That was not clear, but I'm not going to go back and clarify it. Robert Horn created a system of what he called information mapping, message categories as a guideline for technical writers. Because of the work of all these had to do with textual materials, it did not occur to them that representation should be considered as a separate issue in text. Intelligent tutoring systems. Designers had to wrestle with the problem of message typology. Alan Collins, an early tutor designer, at one point listed 28 different types of things that you could say to a student. That was back in a way primitive part of that history. John R. Anderson developed intelligent systems that placed as many as 6 different types of message in the display at the same time. One of these areas was a control space where you could respond. Anderson also realized that for subjects like geometry, graphical representations had to be used. And so often his tutoring systems would set aside one of these windows for graphics. Knowledge creation, 6 different messages going on the screen at the same time. And yet none of these people who are doing this research were saying, oh, this is a message, and I can define it as a message unit. I can actually take something which is invisible and give it some embodiment, or I give it representation. Knowledge creation systems are of special interest. We're going to come back to those in just a moment because they turned out to be fruitful. Did the magic thing. Like that, didn't like that. That, yes. Linguists studying the structure of conversations, and there is a lot of research on this, by the way. We just discovered a system of utterance types free of any commitments to representation forms. So message structure principles, theory of them. Conversation analysis identifies structures such as turns, adjacency pairs, projects as a part of a conversation, no matter what the topic of the conversation is. These are described at length in the monograph. Conversation analysis research also notes, and this is important, the importance of nonverbal conversational elements, such as facial expressions, gestures, postures, direction of gaze, voice inflection, coughs, sighs, and even silences. Have you ever in a class, somebody said something to you and you just said 5 beats before I respond? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, we have all done this. It also notes how utterances contain emotional modifiers, including embedded messages of confidence, inspiration, approval, disapproval, calming, encouragement, and empathy. Recent advances in software make it possible to create automated conversations of a limited scope. We talk to bots on the phone all the time, and some of them are smart and some of them aren't so smart. As the technology of machine learning advances, more and more sophisticated bot systems are likely to appear. More and more of the initial contact is likely to become bot managed. It is significant. How many chats do you know of that actually take you a long way into the conversation before they have to abandon you to a supervisor? They're getting better. It is significant that the main obstacle to such systems, now this is interesting, is how to interpret the intentions of both learner and bot. So conversation is an interpretation problem. It's how one person sees into another person and sees their intentions and then knows what its intentions are. And that exchange of intentions is the essence of conversation. The words, the gestures, everything else, that's presentations. This highlights the importance of the invisible and hitherto unrecognized message layer of design. Now, back to the use of current knowledge creation systems, many of which are in use in public schools today, funded by commercial enterprises. And that means that they have to pay their own way to survive, to be used, which means they must be successful to some degree. Knowledge creation systems are based on social learning theory. This theory takes it as a given that learners, instructors, and tutors all engage in conversation. Knowledge creation systems, which I'm going to describe in just a minute. Learners take part with other students in problem-solving conversations, expressing themselves using message types provided within a shared virtual or face-to-face workspace. The instructor creates a set of conversational rules and message categories. Within these guidelines, learners interact, instruct what to them is new knowledge. They actually do research among themselves. It becomes a community thing. Individual conversations within the guidelines. There are some key search terms that will lead you into this literature, and you may be familiar with some of these already. Reciprocal teaching is, you ought to know about reciprocal teaching. Computer-supported interactive learning environments, Cecil experiments that turned into a commercial venture, and problem-based learning. Once you get into problem-based learning, can I recommend that you just pay attention to the Barrows variety? Barrows was kind of the conceiver of this message, this theory, this practice. It's been used so much. It's like a book in the library. Some of the pages are torn. When other people have tried to borrow Barrows' idea, they make changes and all of a sudden they can't understand why they don't work anymore. I think Jason knows an awful lot about this phenomenon. Okay, so this returns us to the original question: can designers design conversations? conversations, Dr. Bowling and I concluded that designing conversations is only possible in an indirect sense. Even though conversation forms are desirable, designers can't actually design them. Well, that seems to be a blind alley for us, doesn't it? Why? That's the obvious question. The answer is because conversations are alive and unpredictable. A designer can't put words into people's mouths. However, a designer can prepare the ground and plant the seed for a conversation to occur. After that, the designer can provide scaffolds and supports to nudge the conversation in a productive direction. This, combined with the ability to limit conversational terms through message types, selection can result in designed conversations. And so designers, what can designers design? They can design occasions for conversation, circumstances and environments for conversation, rules or guidelines for conducting conversation, contexts of action up to conversation, scaffolding rules to guide disciplined conversational exchanges, topics for conversation, objects to converse about, tasks during which conversation can occur, questions that lead to conversations, conversational contingencies, and engines for facilitating conversations. Several insights have emerged from the research that Dr. Bowling and I were doing. First, is insight number one. Message design should precede representation design. That we said this already a lot. This is common sense, a common practice in many design industries. We will take as an example message focusing and refining processes used in the advertising and movie industries. Messages are captured and refined using a sophisticated storyboarding process. Go home and watch WALL-E. Ask yourself, what are the messages and how are they conveyed? Half the movie doesn't have any words, really. It's an amazing piece of work. It is an amazing demonstration of how they find the message before they design the record. Slide number two. Conversation provides the most fundamental description of what is meant by interactivity. All interaction designs take the form of a conversation of some sort, sometimes crude. Designers should therefore be trained in principles of conversation analysis. They should be taught about it, that it exists, and their relation to good tutoring practice. If you're going to be involved in design of tutoring systems, mentoring systems, or anything like that, you should probably be familiar so that you can provide guidelines to those tutors and mentors for good tutoring practice. In our research, we found examples of this kind of literature. Site number three. We realized that conversation is a constant, ongoing process of repair. That is a term that you ought to think of because a conversation is a constant process of repair. If one conversational participant makes an ambiguous statement, the second normally tries to disambiguate. This repair of understandings is clearly evident when somebody asks, you can do this little experiment on your own conversations in the hall. You mean, are you trying to say, what do you mean by that? I don't understand. They're asking for a repair. They're asking for something more. It is repair during conversations that brings understandings into alignment, which is the goal of conversing in the first place. Into alignment, emotionally, informationally. This insight has profound implications when applied to how we engage conversations of a spiritual nature. Let's sink in. When you are conversing with people through a lesson, with people through a counseling session, when you're trying to converse with your Heavenly Father, you know what the meaning. And this, our minds being brought into to alignment. What's the process of prayer? What's that? Insight number 4, our fourth insight is that prayer is the natural feedback cycle that tunes meanings and purposes between minds. Without repair, misunderstandings cannot be corrected. Instructional designers should be taught that the principle of repair is the basis for accurate and complete sharing of knowledge and emotion, and that it occurs in conversational interaction form of instruction. So I'm not talking about certain, you'll notice I haven't talked about any particular mode of instruction. The message is fundamental, that it was meaning, the exchange of meaning in all forms of instruction. Fifth, we learned that conversation involves anticipation, which stimulates engagement. As one conversant begins an utterance, the second immediately begins to suss out what this person means, what their intention is, and begins to form a response. And this distance here is measured in milliseconds. That is why people interrupt each other in conversations. They know what they're going to say before the other person's finished what they're saying. So they sometimes miss things. Sixth, engagement in conversation can create a dramatic arc during instruction. Dramatic tension created by anticipation can sustain engagement in conversation. Dramatic arcs have a rising action that leads to an aha. Dramatic reveal. Good face-to-face instructors and tutors understand this and use dramatic arc structures of the work to work toward aha. For instance, if you had a good math teacher and they had one principle they were trying to teach that day. My instructor was Mr. Black. He was the baseball coach. He was a really good teacher too. A big hunky guy with mediocre language skills. He knew about the dramatic arc. He could start the class, and rising action, set back, rising action, set back. At the end of the class, just before the bell rang, we hit the climax, and I don't know how he did it, but he was pretty good at it. The aha is very satisfying feeling. Because of it, learning can become comforting and satisfying. And that's what we want. We want to create lifelong learners. We want them to have a satisfying, not a medicinal experience. Seventh, conversation is the process of guessing the intentions and meanings of the other person. This leads to a concept found in conversational analysis literature called action. What action is the other person trying to perform? What does this person want from me? What are they expecting? Finally, conversants converse in order to perform actions like requesting, telling, accepting an offer. If you're walking down the hall and you see someone approaching that you want to talk, oh, I got to talk to you about, that's saying, I want to perform an action, conversational action with regard to you. I've got to give you the following information. I've got to find the following information. There are several actions that you perform during your conversation. Here is an example. Consider, don't worry about reading that. Consider the number of request-making actions recognized by a young child compared with the number of request-making actions recognized by a mature adult. At a picnic, someone may ask, does someone see the salt? And a child will respond, I see it over there. While an adult will likely respond by taking the action of passing the salt. There's a difference. The mature person knows what the person is asking, what the action is that they're performing. Learners can respond appropriately only to actions that they recognize. Part of learning consists of learning new actions. Part of becoming a lifelong learner. conversational mode. Means that you're learning constantly in actions. Instructional designers must sufficiently aware of the populations for whom they design and the actions they most likely recognize, because actions conveyed in messages and terms are part of the engine that moves conversations forward. They can represent sources of communicative power or sources of confusion. There are many more lessons from this study that could be covered in this short presentation. I think there's time. I hope there's time for 5 minutes of questions before 50 minutes till. We refer you to the publication, of course. We do believe the message construct is valid as a theoretical design construct. We believe that we've met the goal that we had set for ourselves. A considerable body of experience and research should accumulate from this base to inform the designer how to use the principles of conversation to fashion more effective designs. And that's the idea. The ideas, you see why I was reading it, because there's a lot of nuance in that message that I was trying to convey. And I did use gestures. I used other tools to help me. No pretty pictures, Charles.
Are you open for questions?
Yeah, I'd like to, if there's time. And somebody tell me when it's time to. Okay.
So first, I want to thank you for sharing this with us. I think there's a lot of real insights here. And one of the things that made me think about, and I'm going to use kind of a metaphor example to describe this. You know, many of us believe in this idea that God can communicate with us through the Spirit. So in a way that doesn't maybe communicates a greater amount of information, or the message can actually be different because it's coming that way rather than him speaking words. And so I'm wondering if there's a similar thing happening here when we talk about kind of the constraints in an online learning environment that may be text-based or maybe even different, that somehow the complexity and the kinds of messages that we can create are constrained by the other layers that surround the message that we would ultimately like to, or the conversation that we'd like to create.
Let me do repair. Let me ask you what you intend to say, what your meaning is the example. Test. Does the media technology constrain the messages that we can send? How nuanced they are? Yeah. My answer is going to be no. And I'll tell you why. Especially in spiritual learning, which a lot of is done on this campus. Does anybody have a scripture with scriptures with you? Go to Doctrine and Covenants, section 50, verses 21 and 22. And somebody volunteer to read it when you find it.
Say section 50.
Section 50, verses 21 and 22. The Lord is scolding people, missionaries, in this case, at a conference. So read it with your outside voice.
Therefore, why is it that ye cannot understand and know that he that receiveth the word by the Spirit of truth receiveth it as it is preached by the Spirit of truth? Wherefore he that preacheth and he that receiveth understand one another, and both are edified and rejoice together.
So in a spiritual context, let's say, trying to get spiritual understanding But through the Holy Ghost, we want the Holy Ghost to accompany what we're learning, to stimulate what we're learning, to feel what we're learning. Is the Holy Ghost constrained by technology? If so, General Conference is a bust. There's no reason for it. If so, Rick?
I mean, I agree with you, but general authorities still value meeting in person when they can.
They do.
General conference is necessity as much as anything. They still travel around as much as they are physically able to and try to meet in person with the saints. And they talk about why we want to meet with the saints.
That's true. Let's go back and read the second verse, verse 22 again.
Wherefore he that preacheth and he that receiveth understand one another, and both are edified and rejoice together.
Okay. In that verse, it's implied that both the person who speaks and the person who is listening are edified together by what? By the charisma of the person who's speaking, or by the immediate availability. Read the verse before, read verse 21.
Therefore, why is it that ye cannot understand and know that he that receiveth the word by the Spirit of truth receiveth it as it is preached by the Spirit of truth?
So who really is the teacher? He that receiveth the truth, receiveth it by, who's the teacher? Who's the one who conveys the knowledge to our hearts?
The Spirit.
The Spirit is the teacher. And those who are engaged in this conversation rejoice together and learn and are edified. One of the things, when I was teaching my classes here at BYU, I would tell the students at the beginning of the semester, before the semester is over, we are all going to have an experience together. It's going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen. But we are going to be in a conversation, writing at the board, talking questions, answering. And all of a sudden, we're going to realize that we have just invented something that none of us knew before. Much of the ideas for my own writing came from classes as I was talking or somebody else was talking. And all of a sudden, the Spirit comes in from the side because we've let down our defenses, let down our barriers. And all of a sudden, it sinks into us. And all of a sudden, dots get connected that weren't connected before. Now, here's a problem that we have with technology, though, Charles, and Rick. I understand your objection because, you know, talking to people, there are a whole lot of people out here who can't join this conversation directly. Hello, everybody out there. And the deal is, what about them? Can they have an enlightened experience? Can they? So there are some limitations. But as designers, our job is to make the medium transparent to the extent that we possibly can. So the medium doesn't get in the way of the message. And so you were right and you were right. And it's a limitation that we accept.
Okay, we're gonna have to call it here at this time. So let's thank Dr. Gibbons again. Stay, maybe entertain other questions during lunch.
Yes, I'd love to.
And there were a couple of questions on the chat that I'll get to you as well, so you maybe put some time to answer those.
Thank you. Yes, I'll be available.